If the New Testament was written by the apostles, is there any evidence the books can be dated to within the apostles' lifetime? And is there any evidence they were written by the people who they are credited to? We've already discussed the oral tradition of the New Testament, and that it can be reliable even up to the late dates of the Gospels. But are not some of these dates too late to have been written by the actual apostles? Well, first, we need to discuss why many historians date them so late. The main reason is based on a twofold argument. First, Mark is assumed to be the first Gospel, because it is the shortest. Matthew and Luke are said to be based off of Mark, so they must have come later. And John came last from an independent source. Then, historians point out Mark 13 is a vivid prophecy by Jesus of the destruction of the temple and the surrounding events, which took place in 70 AD. So since the author of Mark speaks so clearly about this event, he must have had prior knowledge of it to be so accurate. I believe this argument is based on a presupposition that Jesus could not have been who he claimed to be. Therefore, he could not have made an accurate prediction that was fulfilled in 70 AD. Therefore, we have to date the Gospels after 70 AD, since Jesus could not predict the future. Not only is that starting with a presupposition, it doesn't seem fair to the text, since there is a lot of evidence which leads to early dates for the Gospels. It could just be that Jesus was echoing the first destruction of the temple by Babylon, and even from a secular standpoint, atheist Maurice Casey argues extensively that Mark 13 should be dated to around 40 AD. Second, it is assumed Mark was first because it is the shortest. However, oral tradition specialist Albert Lord points out oral narrative parallels that we have found doesn't necessarily mean the shorter version is older. It may be the result of practical constraints. Those who argue Matthew was written first argue Mark was shortened for a Gentile audience who would not understand the prophecies of the Old Testament being fulfilled in the Jewish context Matthew constantly refers to. But that is a topic for another video. Third, there is actually a lot of external and internal evidence, which suggests the Gospels were written by the men who they are credited to. Looking at the external evidence, the early church fathers are unanimous that the Gospel of Matthew was written by the disciple Matthew. Mark was written by Mark, the interpreter of Peter in Rome. Luke was written by Luke, the companion of Paul. And John was written by the disciple John. Tertullian, writing around 200 AD in North Africa, tells us that the documents of the Gospels were written by the apostles Matthew and John and apostolic men of Luke and Mark. Prior to that, St. Irenaeus of Lyons tells us Matthew wrote a gospel among the Jews in their own style, while Paul and Peter were preaching in Rome. Then Mark, the disciple of Peter, handed to us the preaching of Peter. Then Luke, a follower of Paul, set forth his own gospel. Later, John, the disciple of the Lord, put out a gospel while residing in Ephesus. So Irenaeus tells us John wrote later than the other three, implying the first three were possibly written around the same time. Clement of Alexandria, writing in Egypt around the same time as Irenaeus, tells us the Gospels with the genealogies came first. Mark was done at request while Peter was preaching in Rome, and that John came last at the urging of friends. So we get the same idea that Irenaeus tells us, that the first three were written around the same time, and John came last. The Muratorian fragment, which dates to the middle of the 2nd century, is a list of an early canon. The first page was lost, however the second page starts with, "at which nevertheless he was present," and so he placed them in his narrative. The third book of the Gospel is that according to Luke, Luke the well-known physician. The fourth of the Gospels is that of John, one of the disciples, to his fellow disciples and bishops, who had been urging him to write. So we are told Luke was third, John was last, and it starts with the same idea church fathers tell us, that Mark was present while Peter was preaching in Rome and wrote down what Peter taught, although the names on the first page are lost. Preserved in Eusebius' Ecclesiastical History is a quote from Papias of Hierapolis, written before 125 AD. This too the elder used to say, Mark, who had been Peter's interpreter, wrote down carefully, but not in order, all that he remembered of the Lord's sayings and doings, for he had not heard the Lord, or had been one of his followers, but later, as I said, one of Peter's. Peter used to adapt his teachings to the occasion, without making a systematic arrangement of the Lord's sayings, so that Mark was quite justified in writing down some things just as he had remembered them. For he had had one purpose only, to leave out nothing that he had heard, and to make no misstatement about it. He also says Matthew wrote the Logia in the Hebrew dialect. To whether Papias was referring to the Gospel of Matthew, or an older list of sayings of Jesus, sometimes referred to by scholars as Q, we do not know. Tim McGrew makes an excellent point regarding all this external evidence. If you plot all four church fathers on a map, you see we have wide attestation of the authors of the Gospels from all over the ancient world. This is the kind of testimony we dream of receiving with other ancient documents. When we have multiple authors in different regions all telling us the same general story, we have excellent evidence the Gospels were written by those who they are attributed to. On top of this, we have no other tradition or testimony which attributes authorship to anyone else. There is no competing tradition. Plus, if the Church Fathers just made up authors to attribute to the 4 Gospels, why is there not unanimous attestation to who wrote Hebrews? Hebrews is truly anonymous, and Church Fathers had to try to guess as to who the author was. If they made up the authors of the Gospels, why not do the same with Hebrews? And also, why not give all 4 Gospels prominent names? Surely they could have done better than Mark and Luke, who never met Jesus and were later disciples of the apostles. If you're just making it all up, why not pick 2 of the other disciples? It would have made the Gospels look better instead of attributing them to men who were never considered church founders or disciples of Jesus. Some skeptics try to claim the Gospels cannot be trusted because they do not mention the authors internally, but this was how the majority of ancient biographies were written. The majority of works from the ancient world have to be externally attributed. E.P. Sanders says, "The claim of an anonymous history was higher than that of a named work. In the ancient world, an anonymous book, rather like an encyclopedia article today, implicitly claimed complete knowledge and reliability. It would have reduced the impact of the Gospel of Matthew had the author written, 'This is my version,' instead of, 'This is what Jesus said and did.' So looking at the external evidence, we have good evidence they are written by the apostles and men who they are attributed to. So the claim of later imposters is without evidence and unwarranted. So if we compare this external authorship for the Gospels with other ancient works, we can see how much better off the New Testament is compared to these others. The first person to attribute the Annals to Tacitus is not until St. Jerome. Thucydides' works are not attributed to him until Polybius, over 200 years later. Whereas with the New Testament, we have multiple authors within 150 years, and one author who is less than 50 years from the source, who even testified there were still living disciples in his day. Moving on, we have a lot of good evidence the first 3 Gospels can be dated to prior to 70 AD. First, none of the Gospels directly mention the destruction of the temple, and this is inconsistent with their style of pointing out things that happened after the fact. For example, when all 4 Gospels mention Judas for the first time, they all make the note that he later became a traitor. So when the Gospels talk about past predictions or events, they are keen to mention the later effects, like that Judas would later become a traitor. In Acts 11, Luke mentions the prediction of a coming famine, then notes this happened during the reign of Claudius. In John chapter 2, we see a conversation between Jesus and the Jews, where Jesus speaks of raising up his body after 3 days. In verse 22, John mentions what Jesus was speaking about was when Jesus was raised from the dead. All these examples indicate that when the Gospels mention something spoken in the past and having been fulfilled by the time they were writing, they would mention that it had already taken place. However, it is clear Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple as recorded in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They simply mention that Jesus predicted this, yet do not indicate it has already happened. This seems inconsistent with their style of mentioning when something was fulfilled or later occurred by the time they wrote, especially with Matthew, who loved to mention Old Testament passages that were fulfilled in his lifetime. Second, the language of the Gospels and Acts indicates they were written in a pre-persecution time. In 64 AD, the first great Christian persecution began. Christians were fed to wild animals, burned alive, tortured, and crucified. Because of this, anti-Roman works like the Revelation of John and the forged Apocalypse of Peter were produced, which didn't paint Rome in a good light or speak well of their persecutors later in hell. Scholars note these works represent the anguish Christians were feeling during and after great persecutions, and the new anger they now had for their Roman persecutors. However, in the Gospels and Acts, we do not see the same attitude towards Rome. Luke often paints Romans in a good light, such as a Roman who rescued Paul from dying at the hands of Jews, and another later treating Paul kindly, as well as a Roman centurion who comes to Jesus for help. Mark portrayed a Roman centurion as one of the few at the cross who understood Jesus was the Son of God. Rome is never really made out to be the enemy in the Gospels or Acts, but the focus is more on the Jewish sects, who were persecuting them long before Rome started. Thus, this indicates an early dating for these documents. Third, external and internal evidence both indicate Matthew was writing to a Jewish audience. However, the destruction of the temple in 70 AD wiped out the large Jewish population and scattered the remaining. If Matthew was written after 70 AD, to whom was he writing? There lacked a centralized group his gospel would have been directed at. Furthermore, Matthew mentions details that would only matter to a Jewish population still centered in Jerusalem, such as the field Judas hanged himself in. John Wyndham says, "Some of the apologetic, like the account of the suicide of Judas and the account of the guard at the tomb, seems of no great theological significance, yet of particular interest to those who frequented Jerusalem. It makes more sense Matthew is writing a gospel for Jews in Judea prior to 70 AD. Fourth, in Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham cites evidence that many elements of Mark fit with a community prior to 70 AD. One aspect pointed out is the Gospels are filled with names, which represent an authoritative list of witnesses people could question to verify the Gospel accounts. However, in many places in the Synoptic Gospels, many key eyewitnesses are left anonymous. Scholars like Gerd Thiessen and Craig Evans point out key witnesses were left anonymous for their protection, since they still could have been prosecuted by the Jewish authorities. For example, in Mark, we are told someone cut off the ear of a soldier in trying to protect Jesus. And in retelling of the story, he is left anonymous for his protection, since if his name was told, the Jewish authorities, who still had power in Jerusalem, could arrest him for attacking a soldier. However, by the time John is written, we find out it is Peter, thus telling us that by the time John was written, which is the last gospel, keeping Peter's identity secret was no longer necessary, as by this time the Jews had lost their power in Jerusalem. Thus the Passion narrative in Mark must be placed prior to 70 AD. As Gerd Thiessen says, "Only in Jerusalem was there a reason to draw a cloak of anonymity over followers of Jesus, who had endangered themselves by their actions. The date could also be pinpointed. Parts of the Passion account would have to have been composed within the generation of the eyewitnesses and their contemporaries, that is, somewhere between 30 and 60 AD. Bachman cites several other examples that Mark keeps anonymous for their protection, telling us parts of Mark were written early, and while the Sanhedrin still had power in Jerusalem. Fifth, and most importantly, look at how the book of Acts ends. The final section is a build-up to Paul's trial in Rome. Several chapters are spent building up for Paul to head to Rome and face trial. However, Acts ends with Paul arriving in Rome and the statement, he lived there 2 years at his own expense. There is no mention of his trial or if he was ever released or not. The climactic build just ends without a payoff. It is agreed Paul arrived in Rome in 60 AD based on the fact that Acts mentions a change in procurator from Felix to Festus, which dates to 59 AD. Acts records it was Festus that sent Paul for trial in Rome. Thus, if Acts ends 2 years later with Paul still waiting for trial in Rome, it would seem that is when Acts was completed. Otherwise, why would Luke build up to a climactic trial only to leave his readers guessing if Paul was released or not? Tradition teaches Paul was released at this time, so it would have been the perfect note to end on, and Paul was finally released and headed back out to preach the gospel once again, as the Lord instructed. So the likely possibility is that Acts was completed before the trial, which probably disappointed his readers, but is good historical data for us today. Luke also begins Acts by mentioning this is his second book. Therefore, his gospel would have been written before Acts and before 62 AD. This would imply Mark was also written earlier, since Luke was mostly based off of Mark. Thus, we have plenty of evidence that at least the first 3 Gospels and Acts were written before 70 AD and even before 62 AD. Therefore, from internal and external evidence, we can estimate when they were completed. Church fathers tell us Mark was written in Rome and is the account of Peter's preaching. Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in 49 AD, but the decree would have ended in 54 AD when Claudius died. This would have allowed Peter and Mark to go to Rome and preach. However, Peter probably didn't go to Rome right away, since Paul's letter to the Romans, which is dated to 56 AD, doesn't mention or greet Peter. Yet Paul greets dozens of others by name. It is unlikely he would have left Peter out. Thus, Mark was most likely written after 56 AD, when Peter would have arrived, so probably between 57 and 60 AD. Luke mentions he gathered sources for his gospel in the first chapter, which most likely would have happened while Paul was in prison under Felix in Judea. This would have allowed Luke to acquire the sources for his Gospels by speaking and meeting with the early church. However, internal evidence indicates Luke relied heavily on Mark. Therefore, completion would not have happened until Paul and Luke arrived in Rome, where he could draw from Mark the account of Peter and his own sources to finalize a Gospel between 60 and 62 AD, as well as write Acts. Now, Eusebius cites a tradition that Peter went to Rome in the 40s under Claudius to deal with the heretic Simon Magnus. It is possible Mark was with him there, and Mark could have written as early as the 40s. This would tentatively move Luke back as well. However, neither of these are necessary and it lacks extensive data. Whether Matthew existed prior to Mark or is based off of Mark is debatable. Most scholars believe Matthew was based on Mark. However, from external evidence, there is a possibility Matthew was the first gospel written. Early church historian Eusebius places Matthew as early as 41 AD. However, other church fathers like Irenaeus seem to suggest a later date. Therefore, Matthew was probably written in Judea somewhere around the 50s and 60s in Aramaic, and was later translated in Greek. Some internal evidence may suggest John was written before 70 AD. John 5:2 speaks in present tense of a sheep gate by a pool in Jerusalem, which would not have been there if John was writing after 70 AD. However, external evidence suggests John was written after his exile, and after he completed Revelation. External evidence also indicates John lived well into old age, so he could have written as late as 96 AD. However, the Muratorian fragment says the disciple Andrew was with John when he wrote his Gospel, and it is unlikely Andrew would have also lived as long as John. Therefore, John could be dated anywhere between 66 and 96 AD. Church Father Papias, in his statement that Matthew wrote the Logia, may be referring to an early collection of Jesus' acts and statements, which scholars refer to as Q. If this document did exist, it would predate the Gospels, and the writing of it probably would have started during the ministry of Jesus. Matthew, being a tax collector, would not only have known Greek and Aramaic, but would also have access to papyrus for writing. However, there is no agreement on what Q would have contained, and there is not good evidence it even existed. Plus, a study of oral tradition shows it wasn't necessary. The dating of most of Paul's letters is not speculative, as there are generally agreed upon dates. However, we will discuss the other New Testament books in more detail in another series where we can look at each book individually. Generally speaking, though, there is plenty of evidence to date the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament books reasonably within the apostles' lifetimes, and there is no reason to doubt their authorship.